Morning arrived, wrapped in silver mist that clung to London's rooftops like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of chimneys and church spire. The edges of chimneys and church spires, until the familiar cityscape appeared, transformed into something from a half-remembered dream. I awakened to find Holmes already dressed and moving quietly about our sitting room, his travelling coat laid carefully across the back of his chair, his small valise packed and waiting by the door, with the methodical precision that characterized all his preparations. The fire had been rebuilt, though it burned lower than the previous evening's blaze, providing just enough warmth to counter the October chill that had settled into the room overnight. And through the windows, I could see the pale grey light of dawn struggling to penetrate the fog that had rolled in from the Thames during the small hours. We breakfasted simply but well, Mrs. Hudson having intuited our need for travel provisions and prepared not only our morning meal, but also a basket of sandwiches and a flask of strong tea for the journey ahead. The good woman appeared in our doorway as we were finishing our coffee, her face showing the maternal concern she tried so often to disguise beneath practical efficiency, reminding Holmes to send word once we were safely arrived in Whitby, and extracting from me a promise that I would ensure he ate properly and slept adequately, as though the great detective was still a wayward schoolboy rather than a man approaching his middle 30s. The cab arrived precisely at 9:30, its horse's hooves clopping softly on the fog-dampened cobblestones, the sound muffled and distant as though reaching us from some other world entirely. Holmes locked the door to our rooms with deliberate care, pocketing the key before descending the stairs, and I followed with our modest luggage, breathing in the cool, misty air that smelled of coal smoke and the river and that peculiar metallic scent that London fog possessed, a smell I had grown to find oddly comforting in my years of residence there. The journey to King's Cross Station passed in contemplative silence, both Holmes and I lost in our own thoughts as the cab wound through streets, slowly awakening to the day's commerce. Shop fronts emerged from the fog like stage sets revealed by lifting curtains, their windows displaying wares that ranged from practical necessities to exotic luxuries imported from distant corners of the empire. We passed a flower seller arranging her blooms despite the early hour, the bright colours of chrysanthemums and late roses providing vivid contrast to the monochrome morning, and somewhere nearby a church bell tolled the hour with deep resonant notes that seemed to hang in the thick air long after their source had fallen silent. King's Cross presented its usual organised chaos, though the fog had reduced the crowd somewhat, causing some travellers to delay their departures until visibility improved. Our train waited at platform 4, a magnificent beast of iron and steam that hissed and sighed like some living creature impatient to begin its journey northward. Holmes secured us a first-class compartment with the ease of long practice, tipping the porter who stowed our luggage with a coin that brought a grateful smile. And soon we were settled into the plush upholstered seats, watching through the window as the platform slowly began to slide past, and the great station's arched roof receded into the mist behind us. The rhythm of the rails established itself quickly, that characteristic clicking pulse that would accompany us for the next several hours, a sound so constant and regular that it soon faded from conscious awareness, becoming instead a kind of mechanical heartbeat that measured our progress across the English countryside. Holmes produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. Documents he had apparently obtained that morning before I awakened, and I recognized them as research materials about Whitby Abbey and its history, likely borrowed from one of his many obscure sources in the British Museum's reading rooms, or perhaps compiled from his own extensive personal archives. "I thought it prudent," he said, noticing my curious glance, "to familiarize myself more thoroughly with the Abbey's astronomical significance before we arrive. Miss Ashford's telegram suggested specific knowledge of medieval celestial observations, and I would prefer not to appear entirely ignorant of the subject when we meet her this evening." He settled the papers on his lap, adjusting his position to catch the pale light filtering through the compartment window, and I noticed how the fog outside had begun to thin as we left London behind, revealing glimpses of suburban gardens, and then, gradually, the open fields of the home counties spreading away on either side of our railway line. I watched the landscape transform as we travelled northward, the neat geometric farms of the south giving way to rolling hills and patches of woodland, where autumn had painted the leaves in shades of amber, rust, and fading gold. Small villages appeared and disappeared, their church steeples marking the ancient centres of rural communities that had stood in those locations for centuries, perhaps millennia, their rhythms dictated by seasons and harvests, rather than the mechanical time that governed London's frenetic pace. The train made occasional stops at market towns, where passengers embarked and disembarked, where station masters in neat uniforms consulted pocket watches and signalled our departure with precisely choreographed waves of green flags, and where the smell of coal smoke mingled with scents of fresh bread from nearby bakeries, and the earthy perfume of farmers' boots still bearing traces of the fields they had left that morning. Somewhere past Doncaster, as the afternoon light began its slow decline toward evening, a steward appeared at our compartment door, offering tea service, and Holmes accepted with a gracious nod that seemed slightly at odds with his usual brusque efficiency. The tea arrived in a proper service, delicate china cups painted with pastoral scenes, the pot wrapped in a quilted cosy to maintain the brew's heat, accompanied by small sandwiches of cucumber and watercress that reminded me pleasantly of Mrs. Hudson's superior preparations. I poured for both of us, the familiar ritual providing a moment of domestic comfort amid our journey, and as I handed Holmes his cup, I noticed how the steam rose in delicate spirals, disappearing into the cooler air of the compartment, like thoughts dissolving into dreams. "The Abbey," Holmes began, setting aside his papers and accepting the tea with both hands, as though warming his fingers on the cup's heat, was designed according to principles that combined religious symbolism with practical astronomical observation. The monks who built it understood that the two pursuits were not separate, but deeply intertwined. Their prayers followed the canonical hours, which were themselves determined by the sun's position, and their liturgical calendar depended upon accurate calculation of celestial events, particularly the date of Easter, which varies according to complex lunar computations. He sipped his tea thoughtfully, his gaze turning to the window, where the landscape had grown wilder, the cultivated fields giving way to moorland, where heather bloomed purple even in autumn's late days, where rocky outcroppings broke through the thin soil like bones of the ancient earth, revealing themselves. The Abbey church was oriented precisely east-west, as was traditional, but certain windows and architectural features were apparently positioned to mark specific solar events: the equinoxes, the solstices, perhaps other astronomically significant dates. On certain days, sunlight would fall through particular apertures to illuminate specific points within the church, creating what were known as light crosses upon the floor or walls. The tea was excellent, strong, and warming, and I found myself relaxing into the journey's latter stages, feeling the pleasant fatigue that comes from travel mixing with the anticipation of arrival. Outside, the afternoon had ripened into that particular golden quality that October sometimes achieves, when the sun hangs low in the sky and every surface seems to glow with borrowed warmth, when shadows stretch long and thin across the land, like dark fingers reaching toward the coming night. Miss Ashford's research, Holmes continued, his voice taking on that professorial tone he adopted when explaining complex matters, apparently focuses on whether these architectural alignments were merely symbolic or whether they served some practical astronomical purpose, perhaps as a kind of primitive observatory for predicting celestial events, or as a calendar for agricultural planning. Such knowledge would have been tremendously valuable in medieval times, and the monks who possessed it would have been regarded with great reverence, their abbey serving not only as a place of worship, but as a centre of scientific learning. The train began to slow as we approached York, that ancient city whose massive cathedral we could glimpse in the distance, its twin towers rising above the medieval walls like prayers made solid in stone. We did not disembark here, but continued northward after a brief pause, the landscape becoming increasingly dramatic as we pushed toward the coast, the gentle hills giving way to more rugged terrain, where stone walls divided fields of sheep that grazed peacefully in the declining light, their woolly bodies appearing almost luminous against the darkening grass. Twilight found us traversing a final stretch of countryside that seemed suspended between day and night, the western sky still holding bands of orange and pink, while the eastern horizon had already deepened to indigo. And it was in this liminal hour that we finally caught our first glimpse of the North Sea, a vast darkness stretching away to merge with the gathering night, its surface catching the last light in silver threads that marked the movement of unseen currents. The air that came through the slightly opened window tasted of salt and seaweed, carrying with it the ancient smell of the ocean that had witnessed so many centuries of human endeavour along these shores. Whitby announced itself gradually, first as scattered lights appearing in the gathering dusk, then as the denser constellation of a town built on both sides of a river's mouth, and finally as our train slowed and the station platform materialized outside our windows. Gas lamps already lit against the coming darkness, their flames dancing behind protective glass like captured spirits. We gathered our belongings with the weary efficiency of travellers nearing journey's end, stepping down onto the platform where the air was noticeably cooler than London's, sharp with the tang of the sea and carrying the cries of gulls that wheeled overhead even in the dimming light. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the station house, moving toward us with purposeful strides that suggested both urgency and hesitation, and as the lamplight fell across her features, I recognized immediately that this must be Miss Eleanor Ashford, her face showing the strain of recent sleepless nights, but also an unmistakable intelligence that burned in her dark eyes like carefully tended embers. She wore a travelling cloak of deep charcoal wool, its hood thrown back to reveal hair pinned in a practical style that spoke more of scholarly efficiency than fashionable concern, and in her hands she clutched a leather satchel that appeared well worn from constant use, its surface showing the patina of many journeys and much handling. Miss Eleanor Ashford stood perhaps 5 feet and 6 inches tall, her posture erect despite evident exhaustion, and when she spoke, her voice carried the refined accent of Cambridge education, tempered by something warmer, a genuineness that immediately dispelled any pretense of formality. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot adequately express my gratitude that you have come so quickly," she said, her words tumbling forth with the relief of one who has carried a heavy burden alone for too long. I feared my telegram might sound too fantastic, too much like the imaginings of an overwrought mind. But I assure you, the occurrences I described are entirely real, and they have become more frequent and more disturbing with each passing night. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip on the satchel, and I noticed how her eyes kept darting toward the darker corners of the station platform, as though she expected some threat to emerge from the shadows gathered there. Holmes stepped forward with the courteous grace he reserved for those he deemed worthy of respect, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of Miss Ashford's appearance and demeanour, with that rapid assessment I had witnessed countless times before. "You are entirely welcome, Miss Ashford, and I assure you that Dr. Watson and I take all matters of intellectual inquiry with utmost seriousness, regardless of how unusual they may initially appear. Shall we find somewhere more private to discuss the particulars of your situation? Perhaps your lodgings, or, if you prefer neutral ground, a quiet establishment where we might speak without fear of being overheard." The young scholar's face showed visible relief at Holmes's measured response, and she nodded quickly, already beginning to lead us away from the platform toward the station's main exit. "I have taken rooms at the Angel Inn, just up from the harbour on the west side of the river. It is a respectable establishment, and the proprietress has been kind enough to allow me use of a private parlour for my evening studies. We can speak freely there, and I have laid out many of my research materials, which will help illustrate what I have discovered about the Abbey's astronomical alignments." We emerged from the station into the full darkness of a coastal October evening, the sky above now scattered with stars that seemed unusually bright and close, as though the absence of London's light and smoke pollution allowed them to shine with their true intensity. The town of Whitby spread before us in layers of shadow and lamplight, buildings clustering along both banks of the River Esk, which cut through the landscape like a dark ribbon, reflecting the occasional gleam of windows and street lamps. The air held that particular quality of seaside towns after dark, cool and slightly damp, carrying with it the constant whisper of waves breaking against the harbour walls and the rhythmic creaking of ships' rigging, moving in the gentle wind. Miss Ashford guided us through narrow streets that wound between buildings whose origins clearly spanned several centuries, from medieval structures with timber frames and overhanging upper stories to more recent Georgian facades of brick and stone. The cobblestones beneath our feet gleamed wetly where fog was beginning to form, rising from the river in gossamer tendrils that curled around lampposts and drifted through alleyways like wandering ghosts. Few people were abroad at this hour, just the occasional sailor making his way back to his ship, or a late-working fishmonger closing his shop's shutters against the night, and our footsteps echoed softly in the quiet streets, accompanied by the distant sound of the sea's eternal conversation with the shore. The Angel Inn presented a welcoming facade, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, light spilling onto the street through thick glass that distorted the interior into impressionistic suggestions of comfort and conviviality. We entered through a heavy oak door that swung on well-oiled hinges, stepping into a small entrance hall that smelled pleasantly of beeswax polish and the faint, lingering aroma of the evening's dinner service. The proprietress, a stout woman of middle years with a kind face weathered by coastal winds, greeted Miss Ashford with obvious fondness and showed no surprise at the arrival of two gentlemen visitors, merely directing us to follow her up a narrow staircase to the first floor where the private parlour waited. The room she showed us into was everything one might hope for in such an establishment. Modest in size, but impeccably maintained, with a fire already burning cheerfully in the grate. Two comfortable sofas upholstered in worn burgundy velvet, and a large table positioned near the window, where papers and books were spread in organised chaos that spoke of serious scholarly work. Heavy curtains of dark green damask were drawn against the night, and oil lamps placed strategically around the room provided steady illumination that fell kindly on the assembled research materials, without creating the harsh glare of gaslight. Miss Ashford moved immediately to the table, her hands hovering over the papers as though unsure where to begin, while Holmes and I removed our travelling coats and settled ourselves where we could best observe her presentation. The fire crackled softly, a log shifting with a small shower of sparks, and somewhere in the inn below us, the murmur of conversation from the public room created a distant backdrop of human activity that somehow made our small gathering feel more intimate by contrast. "I should begin," Miss Ashford said, her voice steadier now that we were safely ensconced in this private space, "by explaining what brought me to Whitby in the first place, as it provides essential context for everything that followed." She selected a leather-bound notebook from among her papers, opening it to reveal pages filled with precise diagrams and calculations, rendered in a neat, scholarly hand. "My research at Cambridge has focused on medieval astronomical instruments and observational techniques, particularly how monastic communities used architectural features as primitive but remarkably accurate tools for measuring celestial phenomena." She paused to gather her thoughts, and I took the opportunity to pour tea from the service that had been thoughtfully provided, the familiar ritual helping to create an atmosphere of calm collegiality despite the mysterious nature of our gathering. Holmes accepted his cup with an absent nod, his attention entirely focused on Miss Ashford, his mind clearly already beginning to process and categorize the information she was about to share. "Whitby Abbey," she continued, tracing a finger along one of her diagrams, "was renowned even in medieval times as a centre for astronomical study. The Venerable Bede himself was connected to this region, and his writings on the calculation of Easter required sophisticated understanding of lunar cycles and solar movements. I came here 6 weeks ago to survey the Abbey ruins, to measure and document the positioning of certain windows, doorways, and structural elements that I believed might reveal deliberate astronomical alignments." The firelight played across her animated features as she spoke, and I could see the passion for her subject burning as brightly as the flames in the grate. This was a woman who had dedicated herself to scholarship with the same intensity that Holmes brought to detection, and I found myself warming to her immediately, recognizing a kindred spirit who pursued knowledge for its own sake rather than for fame or material gain. What I discovered Miss Ashford said, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone despite our privacy, exceeded my most optimistic expectations. The Abbey's design incorporates not just the expected solar alignments for solstices and equinoxes, but a far more complex system of astronomical markers that appears to have been used for tracking planetary movements and stellar positions with remarkable precision. The west window of the choir, for instance, frames specific constellations at particular times of year, and certain carved symbols in the stonework appear to correspond to astronomical tables I have found in medieval manuscripts. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making the curtains stir despite their weight, and Miss Ashford startled slightly at the sound before continuing with visible effort to maintain her composure. It was approximately 3 weeks ago that the disturbances began, she said, her hands now gripping the edge of the table, as though needing its solidity for support. I had been working late one evening, taking measurements of shadow patterns cast by moonlight through the ruined arches, when I first noticed the lights. Holmes leaned forward slightly in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of intense concentration. Describe these lights as precisely as you can, Miss Ashford. Their colour, their movement, their duration, every detail may prove significant. The young scholar closed her eyes briefly, as though calling up the memory with painful clarity. They were blue-white in colour, like captured starlight, and they moved through the ruins with purposeful direction, not randomly, as one might expect from will-o'-the-wisps or other natural phenomena. They appeared to follow specific paths through the Abbey grounds, pausing at certain architectural features: the base of the bell tower, the remains of the chapter house, the threshold of what was once the north transept. Each pause lasted perhaps 30 seconds to a minute, and during these pauses the lights seemed to pulse or brighten, as though examining or measuring something I could not perceive. She opened her eyes, meeting Holmes's penetrating gaze with admirable directness. I observed these lights on 3 separate occasions over the course of a week, always appearing between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, always following similar paths through the ruins. On the 3rd occasion, I attempted to approach them, to discover their source, but as soon as I left my observation post and began moving through the grounds, the lights vanished instantly, as though aware of my presence and deliberately avoiding encounter. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hour with soft, crystalline notes, marking 9 o'clock and reminding us how the evening had advanced while we travelled northward to this coastal sanctuary, where ancient mysteries stirred in the darkness beyond our cosy parlour. Holmes rose from his seat with fluid grace, moving toward the window, where he drew back the curtain just enough to peer into the darkness beyond. Though from our vantage point, the Abbey itself remained invisible, Abbey itself remained invisible, hidden somewhere on the distant cliff that rose above the eastern side of town. His profile appeared sharp against the faint glow of lamplight from the street below, and I could see his mind working behind those keen eyes, processing Miss Ashford's account and formulating questions that would extract every relevant detail from her experience. The wind outside had strengthened, carrying with it the salt-sharp scent of the sea and the distant boom of waves breaking against the harbour walls with rhythmic persistence. "These disappearances of your research materials," Holmes said, without turning from the window, his voice thoughtful and measured. "You mentioned in your telegram that documents vanished and then reappeared. Tell me about the first such incident, where you had left the papers, when you noticed their absence, and under what circumstances they returned to you." He let the curtain fall back into place, and turned to face Miss Ashford, his expression showing neither scepticism nor credulity, only that patient attention he brought to all genuine mysteries. Miss Ashford moved to one of the sofas, settling herself with visible relief, as though standing had required more energy than she currently possessed, and I noticed dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights spent anxious and alert. "The first disappearance occurred 9 days ago," she began, accepting the fresh cup of tea I offered with a grateful nod. "I had been working here in this very parlour, transcribing measurements and calculations into my primary research journal, a brown leather notebook that contains all my significant findings from the past 6 weeks. When I retired for the night, I left the journal on this table, positioned precisely parallel to the edge, as is my habit, with my pen laid across the top to mark my place." She gestured to the table where her current materials lay spread, and I could see that same meticulous organization in how she had arranged her papers, everything positioned with geometric precision that suggested a mind that found comfort in order and systematic methodology. The fire had burned down slightly, and I rose to add another log, the action feeling natural and domestic, despite the increasingly strange nature of our discussion. The new wood caught quickly, sending up fresh flames that cast dancing shadows across the parlour walls. Holmes had returned to his seat, and now he leaned back with his eyes half closed, his fingers pressed together in that cathedral arch that indicated deep concentration. "And the proprietress and her staff. Did you inquire whether anyone had entered the parlour during the night or early morning?" "I did," Miss Ashford replied, setting down her teacup with a soft clink against the saucer. "Mrs. Hawthorne, that is the proprietress, assured me that no one had been in this room after I retired. She herself unlocked the door the next morning when I requested access, and she swears upon her reputation that she gave the only key to me when I first engaged these rooms. The door was locked when she tried it, just as I had left it the previous evening. A particularly strong gust of wind caused something to rattle against the outside of the building, perhaps a loose shutter or a sign swinging on its chains, and the sound seemed to punctuate Miss Ashford's account with an eerie emphasis that needed no artifice to be unsettling. I found myself glancing toward the curtained windows, despite knowing there was nothing to see but darkness and the occasional glimmer of lamplight from the street below. For 3 days the journal remained missing, Miss Ashford continued, her voice taking on a quality of remembered distress. I was beside myself with anxiety. That notebook represented weeks of careful observation and calculation, measurements that could not easily be replicated, particularly as we move deeper into autumn, and the angles of sunlight change with each passing day. I considered reporting the theft to the local constabulary, but something held me back, some intuition that drawing official attention might complicate matters in ways I could not predict. Holmes opened his eyes fully, fixing Miss Ashford with an intent gaze. A wise instinct, I suspect. And the journal's return, how did that transpire? On the morning of the 4th day, I entered this parlour to find the journal lying in the centre of the table, positioned with the same precise parallelism I habitually employ, the pen once again laid across its cover. Miss Ashford's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, and the room seemed to grow quieter around us, as though the very walls were leaning in to hear her words. But when I opened it to check whether anything had been disturbed, I found something that chilled me far more than the mere fact of its disappearance and return. She rose and went to the table, retrieving a brown leather journal that matched her description perfectly. Its cover worn smooth by handling, its pages filled with diagrams and notations in her neat script. She opened it to a page perhaps 2/3 through and held it out for Holmes to examine. He took it carefully, angling it toward the lamplight, and I moved to stand beside him so I might see what had so disturbed our client. The page showed one of Miss Ashford's careful astronomical diagrams, a representation of the Abbey's floor plan, overlaid with lines indicating sight lines to various celestial phenomena. But across the bottom of the page, in a hand clearly different from Miss Ashford's scholarly script, someone had written a single line in faded brown ink that looked almost rust-coloured in the lamplight. The stars remember what the stones have forgotten. The handwriting was archaic, formed in the elaborate style of an earlier century, each letter carefully crafted with the precision of someone trained in calligraphy, or perhaps educated in an era when penmanship was considered an essential art. The words themselves carried an almost poetic quality, cryptic yet somehow weighted with meaning that lay just beyond immediate comprehension. Holmes studied the inscription in silence for a long moment, then carefully turned to other pages, examining each with meticulous attention. This is the only addition. No other pages marked or altered. His voice remained calm, but I detected an underlying current of fascination that told me his interest had been thoroughly engaged. The only one I could find, Miss Ashford confirmed, resuming her seat as though the effort of showing us the journal had depleted what remained of her energy. I examined every page multiple times, searching for other changes or additions, but found nothing. Just that single cryptic sentence, written in ink that appears aged, as though it had been there for decades rather than days. I moved to refill everyone's teacups, the familiar domestic action providing a moment of normalcy amid increasingly strange revelations, and noticed how the milk swirled in the tea like miniature galaxies forming and dissolving in the amber liquid. Outside, the wind continued its restless prowling around the inn's walls, and from somewhere distant came the mournful toll of a church bell marking the half-hour. The second disappearance, Holmes prompted gently, still studying the journal's mysterious inscription with evident interest, occurred under similar circumstances. Miss Ashford nodded wearily. 5 days ago. This time, it was a folder containing my preliminary analysis of the Abbey's astronomical alignments. Charts showing how specific architectural features frame particular stars and constellations at different times of the year. Once again, I left it here in the locked parlour overnight, and once again it vanished, only to reappear 3 days later with another inscription, this one even more puzzling than the first. She retrieved a manila folder from among her papers and opened it to reveal sheets covered with star charts and geometric calculations. On the topmost page, written in that same antique hand and rust-coloured ink, were the words, "Seek the guardian at the threshold of heaven's door." Holmes set down the journal and took up the folder, examining the new inscription with the same careful attention he had given the first. The room had grown very quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of pages turning as he reviewed Miss Ashford's work. I found myself drawn to the window again, pulling back the curtain to look out at the night-darkened town, wondering what secrets lay hidden in those ancient Abbey ruins, perched on their cliff above the restless sea. He stood and began to pace slowly before the fireplace, his shadow elongating and contracting with each pass through the lamplight's sphere of influence. The question becomes whether these messages are warnings meant to discourage your research, or clues intended to guide you toward some discovery. The tone seems more poetic than threatening, more mysterious than menacing, which inclines me toward the latter interpretation. Miss Ashford watched Holmes with an expression mixing hope and apprehension, clearly yearning to believe her mysterious correspondent meant no harm while remaining frightened by the violation of her privacy and the uncanny nature of the communications. I confess I had not considered they might be helpful rather than hostile, she admitted. The secretive nature of their delivery, the invasion of my private workspace, seemed inherently threatening regardless of the word's content. A sudden, sharp crack from the fireplace made us all start slightly. Just a pocket of sap exploding in the heat, but the sound served to break the spell of tension that had been building in the room. Holmes smiled slightly, perhaps at our collective reaction, and resumed his seat with an air of having reached some preliminary conclusion. The silence that followed held a peculiar quality, pregnant with unspoken thoughts, and I watched as Holmes drew his pipe from his pocket, with movements slowed by contemplation, though he be contemplation, though he did not immediately fill it, merely turning the smooth briar wood between his long fingers as though the familiar object helped focus his racing mind. Miss Ashford had settled more deeply into the sofa's embrace, her earlier tension beginning to ease now that she had shared her burden with allies who took her seriously, and the firelight painted her pale face with warm amber tones that softened the lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes and mouth. Tomorrow morning, Holmes announced with quiet decisiveness, we shall visit the Abbey ruins at first light. I wish to examine the site when the early sun creates the shadows and illuminations you have been studying, to see with my own eyes these architectural alignments you have documented so meticulously. But tonight, Miss Ashford, I would very much like to understand more about what specific discoveries you have made, what patterns you have observed that might explain why someone would take such elaborate measures to either discourage or redirect your research. He finally began filling his pipe, the ritual conducted with such practiced ease that his hands seemed to move independently of conscious thought, and soon the rich aroma of tobacco began to mingle with the smell of burning oak and the faint sea salt dampness that permeated everything in this coastal town. Miss Ashford watched him with something approaching relief, as though his calm, methodical approach to the mystery provided an anchor of rationality in waters that had become disturbingly strange and uncertain. The primary pattern I have identified, she began, reaching for a large sheet of paper that proved to be a detailed architectural drawing of the Abbey's ground plan, involves what I call celestial sightlines, specific alignments where architectural features frame or mark astronomical phenomena with remarkable precision. The monks who designed this structure were not merely building a place of worship, but creating a kind of three-dimensional astronomical instrument, a building that interacted with the heavens in ways that allowed them to track time, seasons, and celestial cycles, with accuracy that would not be matched by mechanical instruments for several more centuries. She spread the drawing across the low table between the sofas, anchoring its corners with books to keep it flat. And both Holmes and I leaned forward to study the intricate details she had rendered. The Abbey's floor plan appeared as a complex arrangement of rectangles and arches, with numerous annotations in Miss Ashford's neat hand, indicating measurements, angles, and astronomical references that spoke of countless hours of painstaking observation and calculation. Here, she pointed to the western end of the nave. The great west window, now largely destroyed, but with enough stonework remaining to determine its original configuration, was positioned so that on the spring equinox, the rising sun would shine directly through it to illuminate the high altar at the eastern end of the church. This is a relatively common feature in medieval ecclesiastical architecture, representing Christ as the light of the world. But Whitby's design goes far beyond this basic symbolism. Her finger traced along lines she had drawn connecting various architectural elements, and I could see the passion for her subject rekindling in her eyes, temporarily overwhelming her fear as she lost herself in explaining her discoveries. Holmes drew on his pipe thoughtfully, exhaling smoke that drifted upward in lazy spirals to disappear among the shadows gathered near the ceiling. The north transept, Miss Ashford continued, contains a series of narrow windows at specific heights and positions that, when moonlight passes through them during particular lunar phases, create patterns on the floor that correspond to a lunar calendar. I have documented these patterns over the past month, watching how the moonlight moves across the ancient stones, and I believe the monks used these natural light displays to calculate the date of Easter, which, as you may know, depends on complex calculations involving both solar and lunar cycles. She paused to sip her tea, which had grown lukewarm, and I quietly poured fresh cups for all of us, the gentle domestic interruption providing a momentary respite from the intensity of her explanation. Outside, the wind had diminished somewhat, leaving behind a deeper silence, broken only by occasional distant sounds. The cry of a night bird, the creak of ship timbers in the harbour, the murmur of the sea against the shore. But the most extraordinary discovery, Miss Ashford said, her voice dropping to a tone of wonder mixed with apprehension, involves what I have come to call the stellar map. In the chapter house, or what remains of it, there are carved stone bosses in the ceiling vaulting, each one decorated with what appear at first glance to be simple floral or geometric designs. But when I measured their positions and compared them to star charts, I realized they form a precise representation of the night sky, as it would have appeared from this location in the year of the Abbey's consecration. Holmes's eyes had sharpened with interest, and he leaned closer to examine the portion of Miss Ashford's drawing that depicted the chapter house. You are suggesting the medieval builders created a permanent stone record of the heavens? A constellation map frozen in architecture? Precisely, Miss Ashford confirmed, her enthusiasm momentarily overcoming her fatigue. Each carved boss represents a specific star or constellation. I have identified Polaris, the pole star, and the major stars of Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, and several other prominent celestial features. But here is what makes this truly remarkable. The positions are not merely decorative, but appear to encode specific astronomical data. The relative sizes of the carvings seem to indicate stellar magnitude. Their positions preserve actual celestial coordinates, and certain groupings may represent planetary positions on significant dates. A soft knock at the door interrupted her explanation, and we all turned as Mrs. Hawthorne entered, bearing a tray laden with covered dishes that released enticing aromas of roasted meat and fresh bread when she set them upon the sideboard. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ashford," the proprietress said, with motherly concern evident in her round face. "But you've barely eaten these past days, and I'll not have guests in my establishment, wasting away from worry and work. I've brought enough for 3, and I'll hear no arguments about not being hungry." The good woman's intervention proved fortuitous, for I had not realized how long we had been talking, or how the evening had advanced toward the deeper hours of night. Holmes thanked her with genuine warmth, and Miss Ashford accepted the food with gratitude that suggested Mrs. Hawthorne's assessment of her recent eating habits was entirely accurate. We took a brief interlude to serve ourselves from the simple but well-prepared meal: sliced beef still warm from the oven, roasted potatoes glistening with butter, bread so fresh it steamed when torn open, and a rich gravy that tied everything together with savoury perfection. We ate in comfortable silence, the food providing both nourishment and a grounding in physical reality after our immersion in mysteries and enigmatic messages. The act of dining together seemed to create a bond of fellowship among us, transforming us from detective, doctor, and client into 3 people sharing a common purpose over a shared meal. I noticed how Miss Ashford's colour improved as she ate, how the tight lines around her eyes gradually relaxed, how she seemed to draw strength from our presence, and our evident commitment to helping her understand the strange events that had so disturbed her peace. When we had finished eating, and Mrs. Hawthorne had returned to clear away the dishes with cheerful efficiency, Holmes returned to his examination of Miss Ashford's architectural drawings, though now his approach seemed more contemplative than analytical, as though he were allowing the information to settle in his mind rather than actively processing it. The fire had burned low again, creating a bed of glowing coals that radiated gentle heat without the distraction of dancing flames. "These inscriptions you received," Holmes said thoughtfully, reaching for the journal and folder to review the mysterious messages once more, "reference both stars and stones, heaven's door and guardians. If we accept the premise that they are meant to guide rather than threaten, then perhaps they are directing your attention towards some specific aspect of your research that you have not yet fully explored. Tell me, in your investigations of these stellar maps and astronomical alignments, have you encountered any features that might be described as a threshold or doorway with particular celestial significance?" Miss Ashford considered this carefully, her brow furrowing in concentration as she mentally reviewed weeks of observations and measurements. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked softly in the quiet room, measuring the passage of moments with mechanical precision, while we waited for her response. Finally, she nodded slowly, as though a connection had just formed in her mind. "There is one feature that might fit such a description," she said, rising to retrieve another sheet from her collection of papers. "The entrance to the crypt beneath the chapter house. The doorway itself is intact, though the stairs descending into the crypt have largely collapsed. What struck me as unusual is that this doorway is oriented not in the typical ecclesiastical fashion, but at an angle that seemed deliberately calculated to align with a specific point on the horizon. I measured it carefully, but had not yet determined what celestial event it might have been designed to mark." She showed Holmes the relevant diagram and I moved to look over his shoulder at the technical drawing depicting a stone archway with precise, angular measurements annotated around it. Holmes studied it in silence, his pipe having gone out unnoticed as his full attention focused on the problem before him, a threshold leading underground. He murmured, almost to himself, positioned to frame some astronomical phenomenon. The guardian at heaven's door, perhaps not a person, but an architectural feature, serving as a marker or pointer towards something significant. He looked up at Miss Ashford, with eyes bright with intellectual excitement. "I believe our mysterious correspondent is telling you to pay particular attention to this crypt entrance, to observe what appears in its frame at specific times. The question becomes, what time and what celestial event?" The wind outside had fallen completely now, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost expectant, as though the night itself were holding its breath in anticipation of revelations yet to come. Outside in the darkness, a church bell tolled 11 times, the sound drifting across the sleeping town, with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. Inmost supernatural in the windless night, each chime hanging in the air like a question, waiting for its answer, before fading into the silence that followed. Miss Ashford moved to the window as the final note dissipated, pulling the curtain aside to reveal glass that now showed nothing but her own pale reflection against the blackness beyond. A ghost of herself, superimposed over the invisible landscape where the Abbey ruins stood sentinel on their distant cliff. Holmes had risen as well, drawn perhaps by the same restless energy that often seized him when a case began to reveal its underlying patterns, and he stood now with one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his profile illuminated by the soft glow of the coal bed, as he gazed into its ember heart with that distant expression I had learned meant his mind was ranging far beyond our immediate surroundings. The room had grown quieter somehow, as though the late hour had thickened the very air, muffling sound and slowing time, until each moment stretched long and dreamlike. "Miss Ashford," Holmes said, without turning from his contemplation of the fire, his voice pitched low and thoughtful. "You mentioned that the mysterious lights appeared always between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. In your astronomical calculations, have you noted any celestial events that occur specifically during those hours? Any alignments or phenomena that might draw someone to the Abbey ruins at such an inconvenient time?" The young scholar let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the table where her charts and calculations lay spread like an arcane text waiting to be deciphered. She sorted through several sheets before selecting one covered with tables of times and celestial coordinates, running her finger down columns of numbers with practiced ease despite the hour and her evident exhaustion. "The constellation Draco," she said, after a moment's study. "The dragon reaches its highest point in the northern sky during those hours at this time of year. It is a circumpolar constellation, meaning it never sets below the horizon at our latitude, but circles endlessly around Polaris, like a celestial guardian keeping eternal watch. In medieval astronomy and astrology, Draco held particular significance. It was associated with wisdom, ancient knowledge, and the guardianship of sacred places." Holmes turned from the fire with an expression of satisfaction, as though Miss Ashford had confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. A dragon as guardian, heaven's door as threshold. The symbolic language becomes clearer. Your mysterious correspondent seems to be working within a framework of medieval astronomical symbolism, using the language of that earlier age to communicate something about your discoveries. The question remains whether this person possesses genuine knowledge about the Abbey's astronomical purposes, or merely enough historical understanding to create convincing mystification. I had been sitting quietly through this exchange, content to observe and listen as Holmes and Miss Ashford pursued their intellectual inquiry into realms of medieval astronomy and architectural mystery. But now a practical consideration occurred to me that seemed worth voicing. If the lights appear with such regularity, and if they are connected to observations of Draco or other celestial phenomena visible during those midnight hours, then surely the most direct approach would be to keep watch at the Abbey tonight and observe what transpires. We might learn more from a few hours of careful observation than from any amount of theoretical speculation. Holmes smiled at my suggestion, that quick, warm expression he reserved for moments when I had articulated something he himself had been contemplating. Ever the man of action, Watson. Yes, I believe you are absolutely correct. We should see this mystery firsthand, rather than relying solely on second-hand accounts, however reliable Miss Ashford's observations have proven to be. The night is still young enough, and the sky appears clear despite the earlier fog. If we were to make our way to the Abbey grounds within the hour, we would have ample time to position ourselves advantageously before the witching hour arrives. Miss Ashford's face showed a mixture of relief and trepidation at this proposal, clearly torn between her desire to understand the phenomena that had so disturbed her, and a very natural reluctance to return to those dark ruins, where mysterious lights wandered through ancient stones. She gathered her papers with hands that trembled only slightly, organizing them into neat stacks as though the familiar action helped steady her nerves. "I should warn you," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "The climb to the Abbey is not trivial, particularly in darkness. The 199 steps are steep and uneven, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' feet, and there are no railings or guides once one leaves the town proper. I have made the ascent many times, but always with proper lanterns, and usually in daylight, or at least early evening when some ambient light remains." Holmes was already moving toward where our travelling coats hung on the stand near the door, his movements energized by the prospect of active investigation. "Then we shall take lanterns and move with appropriate caution. I suspect the climb will prove less daunting than the mystery awaiting us at the summit, and the physical exertion will help keep us alert during our vigil. Watson, your service revolver, do you have it with you?" I nodded, patting the pocket where the familiar weight of the weapon rested, though I sincerely hoped its presence would prove unnecessary. Holmes caught my gesture and smiled again, this time with a hint of reassurance. "Merely a precaution, my dear fellow. I do not anticipate violence, but it seems wise to be prepared for any eventuality when investigating unexplained phenomena in isolated locations during the darkest hours of night." Mrs. Hawthorne appeared with remarkable timing, as though she possessed some sixth sense for when her guests might require assistance, carrying 3 stout lanterns, already filled with oil and fitted with fresh wicks. "I thought you might be wanting these," she said, with the air of one who had seen enough strange comings and goings in her establishment to take midnight expeditions in stride. "The path to the Abbey is treacherous after dark, and you'll need good light to see your way safely. Mind you watch for the loose stones on the upper steps. Many a pilgrim has taken a tumble there over the years. We thanked her warmly and prepared ourselves for the journey ahead, donning our coats and checking that the lanterns functioned properly before venturing out into the night. Miss Ashford wrapped herself in her cloak and retrieved a small notebook and pencil, clearly intending to document whatever we might observe with the same scholarly precision she brought to all her work. The inn's entrance hall felt almost unbearably warm and bright as we prepared to leave its sanctuary, and I found myself reluctant to exchange its comfort for the cold darkness waiting beyond the door. The town greeted us with profound silence when we stepped outside. The streets empty of human activity, the windows of surrounding buildings dark as their occupants slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that 3 investigators were setting forth to unravel mysteries written in starlight and ancient stone. Our lanterns cast pools of golden illumination that seemed fragile and temporary against the vast darkness, and our footsteps echoed with unnatural loudness on the cobblestones as we made our way through narrow lanes toward the eastern bank of the River Esk. The bridge spanning the river loomed before us, its stone arch dark against the slightly lighter sky, where stars had begun to emerge from behind dissipating clouds, and the water below moved with a quiet rushing sound that spoke of tides and currents flowing according to the moon's ancient pull. We crossed in single file, our lantern light reflecting in fragmented pieces on the water's surface, creating the illusion of fallen stars drifting on the dark current toward the invisible sea. On the far side of the bridge, the land rose steeply, and we found ourselves at the base of the legendary stairway that climbed toward the Abbey ruins, perched high above on the east cliff. The steps stretched upward into darkness, each one carved from stone worn smooth and slightly concave by countless feet over countless years, and looking up toward where they disappeared into the night, I understood Miss Ashford's warning about the climb's difficulty. The rises were uneven, varying in height and depth, clearly the work of medieval craftsmen who had followed the natural contours of the cliff rather than imposing geometric uniformity. "Stay close together," Holmes advised, lifting his lantern to better illuminate the path ahead, "and take your time. There is no urgency that justifies risking a fall." With that sensible counsel to guide us, we began our ascent, moving slowly and carefully, each step requiring attention and deliberation as we climbed higher above the sleeping town. The physical exertion warmed our bodies against the October chill, and soon I found my breathing deepening with the effort, my legs feeling the strain of the continuous upward progress. Around us, the darkness seemed to press close despite our lanterns, and I became aware of sounds I had not noticed from below. The whisper of wind beginning to rise again, now that we had climbed above the sheltering buildings of the town. The distant crash of waves against cliffs somewhere in the blackness to our right. The occasional cry of seabirds, disturbed by our passage through their nocturnal domain. Halfway up the stairway, we paused to rest on a wider landing where stone benches had been placed centuries ago for the benefit of weary pilgrims. And from this vantage point, we could look back down at Whitby spread below us, a constellation of dim lights mirroring the stars beginning to populate the clearing sky above. The river gleamed like a dark ribbon through the town's centre, and beyond it I could just make out the shape of the Abbey's western counterpart, the parish church of St. Mary, its squat tower rising from its cliff-top perch on the opposite side of the harbour. Miss Ashford pointed upward with one gloved hand, directing our attention to the sky where clouds had parted to reveal a magnificent display of stellar beauty. "There," she said softly, "Draco, the dragon constellation, just coming into its prominence. See how it winds between Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, its head marked by that bright star Eltonin, its body spiraling around the celestial pole. Mind." I followed the line of her gesture into the vast darkness overhead, finding at first only a scattered confusion of light, points before my eyes adjusted, and began to perceive the patterns she indicated, the serpentine arrangement of stars that ancient observers had seen as a celestial dragon coiling through the northern heavens. The constellation possessed a strange beauty, visible only here, far from London's perpetual glow, where the sky could reveal its true depth and complexity, layer upon layer of stellar light, reaching across unimaginable distances to touch our upturned faces with photons that had begun their journey before human civilization had learned to build in stone. Holmes stood beside us in contemplative silence, his lantern lowered now so its light would not interfere with our dark-adapted vision. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that he rarely permitted himself to express. Remarkable to consider that the monks who built the Abbey climbed these same steps night after night, to observe these same stars, tracking their movements with nothing but naked eyes and carefully positioned architectural markers, achieving astronomical precision that would not be surpassed until the invention of the telescope centuries later. Their dedication to understanding the heavens was not mere idle curiosity, but a form of devotion, a way of reading what they believed to be divine messages written in light across the vault of creation. We lingered a moment longer on that halfway landing, breathing the cold sea air that tasted of salt and distance, listening to the night sounds that surrounded us, the rhythmic percussion of waves, the whisper of wind through unseen grasses growing in crevices of the cliff face, the occasional rustle that might have been a roosting bird shifting on its perch, or simply the settling of ancient stones responding to the day's warmth finally dissipating into the October darkness. Then, wordlessly, we resumed our ascent, moving with renewed purpose now that the summit and its mysteries waited just above us. The final section of stairs proved the steepest, and I found myself grateful for the lantern light that revealed each step's edge and saved us from potential missteps that could have sent us tumbling backward down the cliff face. Miss Ashford climbed with the confidence of familiarity, despite her evident nervousness about what we might encounter at the top, and Holmes moved with that peculiar grace he brought to all physical activities, his tall frame somehow managing to appear elegant, even while navigating treacherous medieval stonework in near total darkness. At last the stairs ended, depositing us onto a broader path that led through an old churchyard where weathered gravestones leaned at various angles like crooked teeth, their inscriptions long since rendered illegible by wind and rain and the patient erosion of passing centuries. Beyond the graveyard, rising against the star-scattered sky in jagged silhouette, stood the ruins of Whitby Abbey, its remaining walls and arches creating a skeletal framework that suggested the magnificent structure's former glory, while simultaneously emphasizing its current state of beautiful decay. We extinguished our lanterns upon Holmes's suggestion, allowing our eyes to adjust fully to the starlight that proved surprisingly adequate for navigation, once we had surrendered our dependence on artificial illumination. The Abbey ruins emerged from darkness with ethereal presence stone made luminous by reflected stellar light, shadows pooling in doorways and beneath arches like gathered fragments of the night itself. The wind moved through the empty windows with a sound that was not quite music, but possessed a haunting quality nonetheless, as though the building were breathing slowly, remembering its centuries of prayer and scholarship and quiet contemplation. Miss Ashford led us along a path worn into the turf by countless visitors, moving between standing walls toward the area she had identified as the chapter house, where the stellar map was carved into the surviving ceiling bosses. We moved slowly, careful of our footing on the uneven ground, and I found myself acutely aware of how isolated we were in this place, how far removed from the comfort and safety of the town sleeping below us, how thoroughly we had entered a realm where the present seemed to thin and the past pressed close with almost physical weight. A sudden sharp crack broke the silence, the sound of wood splintering, and we all froze, hands instinctively reaching for our lanterns before Holmes raised a warning hand. The sound came again, unmistakably the noise of something breaking, and then we saw its source. An old wooden door, half rotted and hanging loose on rusted hinges, had finally surrendered to the wind's persistent pressure and torn partially free, swinging now with irregular rhythm that produced intermittent creaking groans, punctuated by the sharper sounds of further splintering. The moment of alarm passed, replaced by cautious amusement at our collective reaction to what proved an entirely natural phenomenon, and we continued our approach to the chapter house with heightened awareness that every sound in this place would seem amplified and potentially significant. The building's acoustics, designed centuries ago to carry the voices of chanting monks, now served to magnify every whisper of wind, every small noise of settling stone or moving wildlife, creating an auditory landscape rich with potential for misinterpretation. The chapter house stood partially intact, its walls rising perhaps 15 feet before ending in ragged edges where the upper stories had collapsed. But enough of the vaulted ceiling remained to show the carved bosses Miss Ashford had described. We positioned ourselves within what had once been the room's interior, now open to the sky, and looked upward at the stone carvings that gleamed palely in the starlight. Even without detailed examination, I could perceive that the bosses were arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be merely decorative, their spacing and positioning suggesting mathematical precision rather than artistic whimsy. "There," Miss Ashford whispered, pointing toward the northern section of the surviving ceiling. "Those 7 bosses form Ursa Major, and if you follow the line from the 2 pointer stars, you find this larger boss that represents Polaris. The entire northern circumpolar sky is mapped here in stone, frozen as it appeared on the night of the Abbey's dedication in the year 1128. Holmes had produced a small notebook and was making quick sketches by the faint light, his hand moving with practiced speed across the page, recording the positions and relationships of the carved elements. "And the crypt entrance you mentioned earlier, where does it lie in relation to this stellar map?" Miss Ashford gestured for us to follow as she moved toward the southern wall of the chapter house, where an arched doorway stood intact, its lintel carved with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shimmer slightly in the uncertain light. Beyond the doorway, stone steps descended into darkness that our eyes could not penetrate, a throat of shadow leading down into the earth beneath the Abbey's foundations. The doorway itself was oriented at what seemed an odd angle relative to the chapter house's main axis, confirming Miss Ashford's earlier observation about its deliberate astronomical alignment. We stood before this threshold in silence, each of us perhaps feeling the weight of symbolism that surrounded it. A doorway leading down when the Abbey's purpose had been to reach upward toward heaven, an entrance positioned not according to architectural convenience, but astronomical necessity, a passage into darkness that might hold secrets the light above had forgotten. The inscription's words echoed in my memory. Seek the guardian at the threshold of heaven's door. Holmes consulted his pocket watch, tilting it to catch the starlight. 11:15. If the mysterious lights maintain their usual schedule, we have perhaps 3/4 of an hour before they might appear. I suggest we find positions that offer good vantage points, while providing some concealment, allowing us to observe without immediately revealing our presence. Miss Ashford, where did you station yourself during your previous observations? She indicated a partially collapsed section of wall, perhaps 30 feet from the chapter house, where fallen stones created a natural blind that would allow observers to remain hidden while maintaining clear sight lines across the Abbey grounds. We made our way to this position and settled ourselves as comfortably as possible among the cold stones, arranging our coats beneath us to provide some insulation from the chill seeping up from the earth. The wait began, and with it came a peculiar quality of time that seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Minutes passing with excruciating slowness while simultaneously feeling as though they raced by unmarked. The wind had died to almost nothing, leaving a stillness that felt expectant, and overhead the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns, Draco circling the celestial pole with patient constancy, indifferent to the small concerns of the watchers huddled among ruins far below. I found my thoughts drifting as we sat in silence, wondering what we would witness in the hours ahead, whether the mysterious lights would appear as promised, or whether this vigil would prove fruitless. A cold, uncomfortable night spent in pursuit of phenomena that might have entirely natural explanations, or might simply have run their course and ceased to manifest. Beside me, Holmes sat with absolute stillness, his breathing slow and measured, his attention focused outward, with that remarkable concentration he could sustain for hours when circumstances demanded. Miss Ashford shifted occasionally, her nervousness evident in small movements she could not entirely suppress, and I could feel the tension radiating from her in waves. The church bell in the town below struck midnight, the sound floating up to us across the dark distance with crystalline clarity, and as the final chime faded into silence, we all tensed, waiting, watching, scarcely daring to breathe, lest we miss some crucial detail. The Abbey ruins stood motionless around us, shadows and stone, empty windows framing portions of the star-filled sky, arches leading nowhere, walls enclosing spaces that no longer existed except as absences defined by standing fragments. And then, so gradually that at first I questioned whether I was truly seeing it, or merely imagining what we had come to observe, a faint luminescence began to manifest near the ruins of the north transept. A pale blue-white glow that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, rather than from any external source. The light pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat rendered visible, its cold radiance casting no shadows despite its brightness, existing somehow independently of the normal laws governing illumination and darkness. Holmes's hand found my arm in the blamy arm in the blackness, his grip firm but not urgent, a silent communication to remain still and observe rather than react. And I felt Miss Ashford beside me draw a sharp breath that she quickly stifled, her body rigid with tension, as we watched the phenomenon she had attempted to describe in her telegram manifesting before our collective witness. The luminescence strengthened gradually, achieving sufficient intensity that we could now see it was not stationary, but moving, drifting with purposeful deliberation along what appeared to be a specific path through the ruins, following a route that led from the north transept toward the central crossing, where nave and transepts had once intersected beneath a great tower, now long collapsed. The light possessed a quality unlike any I had encountered, neither flame nor phosphorescence, nor reflected moonbeam, but something altogether stranger, as though starlight itself had been concentrated and given form, pulled down from the heavens to wander through these ancient stones on some incomprehensible errand. We watched in absolute silence as the light completed its traverse of the crossing, and paused there, hovering perhaps 6 feet above the ground, where grass now grew over flagstones that had once rung with the footsteps of monks processing toward their devotions. During this pause, the luminescence brightened again, pulsing with that same measured rhythm, and I became aware of a sound accompanying it, so faint as to be almost subliminal, a kind of harmonic resonance like distant singing, or perhaps wind moving through organ pipes, though no wind stirred and no organs had sounded in this place for centuries. Then the light resumed its movement, proceeding now toward the chapter house where we had stood, examining the stellar map carved in stone, and as it approached that location, its path brought it near enough that we could observe more detail in its structure. The luminescence was not uniform, but seemed to contain swirling patterns within itself, currents of brightness flowing through slightly dimmer regions, creating the impression of something alive and purposeful, rather than merely a natural phenomenon obeying physical laws. Holmes had begun to edge forward, his movements infinitesimally slow and careful, clearly intending to obtain a closer vantage point despite the risk of revealing our presence. I prepared to follow, but Miss Ashford's hand suddenly gripped my sleeve with surprising strength, and when I looked at her face, I saw an expression of mingled awe and fear that gave me pause. Her eyes were fixed not on the primary light we had been watching, but on something beyond it, and following her gaze, I felt my breath catch in genuine astonishment. A second light had appeared near the Abbey's eastern end, and then a third near the southern wall, and as we watched in growing amazement, more lights manifested throughout the ruins until perhaps a dozen separate sources of that strange blue-white radiance moved through the ancient structure, each following what appeared to be a predetermined path, each pausing at specific locations before continuing its mysterious circuit. The effect was extraordinary, transforming the dark ruins into something resembling a cathedral of light, though the illumination came not from candles or lamps, but from these ghostly presences that drifted through empty windows and beneath broken arches with complete disregard for physical barriers. Holmes had frozen in his careful advance, his silhouette motionless against the faint glow now suffusing the Abbey grounds, and I could see his head turning slowly as he attempted to track multiple lights simultaneously, his analytical mind no doubt cataloguing their movements and searching for patterns in their behavior. The harmonics I had noticed earlier had strengthened with the multiplication of light sources, creating a complex chord that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but somehow within the stones themselves, as though the Abbey were remembering music it had known in life and attempting to reproduce it through some mechanism we could not perceive. The nearest light, the first we had observed, had reached the chapter house doorway and now hung motionless before the crypt entrance Miss Ashford had identified as astronomically significant. As we watched, it began to descend slowly, following the stone stairs down into that subterranean darkness, its glow gradually diminishing as it sank deeper until finally it vanished entirely, leaving only the memory of its passage hanging in the night air like an after-image burned onto our vision. One by one, the other lights completed their respective circuits and converged on the same location, each in turn descending into the crypt entrance until the last had disappeared and the Abbey ruins returned to their previous state of shadow and starlight. The only evidence of what we had witnessed being the fading resonance that took several seconds more to dissipate completely into silence. We remained frozen in our hiding place, scarcely daring to believe what we had observed, waiting to see whether the phenomenon would repeat, or whether this strange performance had concluded for the evening. Long minutes passed in absolute stillness, and gradually I became aware once more of normal night sounds. The distant sea, the whisper of returning wind, the small movements of nocturnal creatures going about their business in the grass and ruins. Holmes finally rose to his full height, moving now with normal speed rather than the exaggerated caution he had employed while the lights were visible. And Miss Ashford and I followed suit, our legs stiff from prolonged immobility on the cold ground. "Extraordinary," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of one who has finally witnessed directly what he had previously known only through second-hand description. "Miss Ashford, your account was entirely accurate, but somehow failed to convey the full remarkableness of the phenomenon. Whatever those lights may be, they are certainly not random manifestations, but follow precise patterns, converging on that crypt entrance with what appears to be deliberate intent." He began walking toward the chapter house, and after a moment's hesitation, Miss Ashford and I followed, retrieving our lanterns and lighting them, now that concealment no longer seemed necessary. The warm glow of our prosaic flames seemed almost harsh after the ethereal quality of the mysterious luminescence, but it served the practical purpose of illuminating our path as we approached the crypt entrance where all the lights had ultimately gathered. Standing once more before that dark archway, peering down stone steps that descended beyond the reach of our lantern light, I felt a reluctance I could not entirely rationalize, some instinctive wariness about following those strange lights into the earth beneath the Abbey. Holmes apparently felt no such hesitation, already beginning to descend with his lantern held high, and Miss Ashford, showing remarkable courage given her obvious nervousness, followed close behind. I took a steadying breath and joined them, feeling the temperature drop noticeably as we left the open air and entered the confined space of the crypt passage. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved directly from the living rock in some places, fitted with dressed stone in others, where the natural formation had proven inadequate. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the enclosed space, the sound seeming to multiply and reflect until it became difficult to distinguish our actual steps from their acoustic ghosts. The walls pressed close on either side, damp with condensation that glistened in the lantern light, and the air smelled of earth and stone, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in spaces sealed from sunlight for centuries. We descended perhaps 30 steps before the passage levelled and opened into a larger chamber, and here we paused, raising our lanterns to examine what lay before us. The crypt was surprisingly intact, its vaulted ceiling supported by thick pillars carved with the same geometric precision that characterized the Abbey's above-ground architecture. But what arrested our attention immediately was not the structural features, but what occupied the chamber's centre, a large circular stone set into the floor, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, its surface carved with elaborate patterns that became visible as we approached and directed our light more carefully upon them. Holmes knelt beside this stone medallion, tracing the carved patterns with one long finger, while holding his lantern close to illuminate the details. The design was extraordinarily complex, combining geometric forms with what appeared to be astronomical symbols, and I recognized some of the same star patterns Miss Ashford had identified in the chapter house ceiling bosses, though here they were rendered in different arrangement, perhaps showing the celestial sphere from a different perspective, or at a different time. Miss Ashford, Holmes said, without looking up from his examination, your expertise is needed here. These symbols, do they correspond to any specific astronomical configuration you recognize? Any particular date or celestial event that might have held significance for the Abbey's builders? The young scholar moved closer, setting her own lantern down and producing the small notebook and pencil she had brought, beginning to sketch the patterns with quick, precise strokes. Her initial nervousness seemed to have been subsumed by scholarly interest, the familiar activity of documentation, providing comfort in this strange underground space where mysterious lights had led us. The outer ring, she murmured, more to herself than to us, shows the zodiacal constellations, but not in their usual order. They appear to be arranged according to their rising times on a specific date. I would need to calculate exactly which date, but this positioning suggests either a solstice or equinox, most likely. Yes, the winter solstice, when the sun reaches its lowest point and the longest night gives way to returning light. She moved her attention to the inner portions of the carved stone, her pencil sketching rapidly. And here, these planetary symbols, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, they are positioned relative to specific stars in a configuration that would be quite rare. This is not merely decorative or symbolic, but represents an actual astronomical event, a specific moment in time when these planets aligned in precisely this relationship to the background stars. Holmes had produced his own notebook and was making observations alongside Miss Ashford's sketches, the two of them working now in the synchronized rhythm of scholars pursuing a shared intellectual puzzle. I held my lantern to provide them adequate light, content to serve as illuminator, while they deciphered the medieval astronomical text carved in stone beneath our feet. A sudden sound from above froze us all, the unmistakable scrape of footsteps on stone, someone descending the stairs we had just used to enter the crypt. The footsteps approached with unhurried confidence, their rhythm suggesting someone familiar with the descent, rather than a cautious intruder feeling their way through unfamiliar darkness. And as we turned toward the starers, we turned toward the stairway entrance, hands moving instinctively toward our lanterns, as though light might serve as both shield and weapon. A figure emerged into the crypt's uncertain illumination. The newcomer was a man of advanced years, perhaps 70 or beyond, dressed in the simple dark clothing of a country clergyman, his white hair forming a soft halo around a face deeply lined by time and weather. but possessing eyes that shone with keen intelligence despite their owner's evident age. He paused at the threshold of the chamber, surveying our small group with an expression that combined amusement and satisfaction, as though he had been expecting to find us here, and was pleased his anticipation had proven accurate. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of education, overlaid with the softer vowels of Yorkshire dialect, creating a pleasing blend that immediately suggested long residence in this region, combined with scholarly pursuits extending beyond local boundaries. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume," he said, directing his words to my companion with the certainty of one who had studied his subject sufficiently to recognize him on sight. "And Dr. Watson, and of course Miss Ashford, whom I have had the pleasure of observing from a respectful distance, I assure you, during her excellent work documenting the Abbey's astronomical features these past weeks. I am Reverend Thomas Blackwood, lately retired from active ministry, but maintaining residence in Whitby as keeper of the parish records and, somewhat unofficially, as guardian of certain historical knowledge regarding this ancient place and its purposes." Holmes had risen to his full height, his bearing relaxed despite the surprise of this interruption, and I saw in his expression not alarm, but rather the pleased recognition of encountering another mind engaged in the same puzzle from a different angle. "Reverend Blackwood," he acknowledged with a courteous nod, "your arrival is remarkably well timed, and I suspect not coincidental. Were you perhaps the author of those cryptic inscriptions in Miss Ashford's research materials, the messages about stars and stones and guardians at heaven's door?" The elderly clergyman moved further into the chamber, producing his own lantern from beneath his cloak, and adding its light to our assembly's illumination, transforming the crypt from a space of mystery and shadow into something more resembling a lamplit study where scholars might gather for quiet discussion. He settled himself with some care on a low stone ledge that ran along one wall, the movement suggesting joints stiffened by age, but a spirit still vigorous and engaged. "Guilty as charged," he admitted with a gentle smile that softened the deep lines of his face. I confessed to a somewhat theatrical approach to communication, but I had my reasons for indirection rather than forthright contact. When I learned of Miss Ashford's research, and in a town this size, very little remains secret for long, I recognized immediately that she was approaching discoveries that have been, let us say, carefully preserved, but not widely advertised for many generations. I needed to assess whether she would prove a responsible custodian of such knowledge before revealing myself and the full extent of what lies hidden here. Miss Ashford had been watching this exchange with an expression combining relief at discovering her mysterious correspondent. Was this kindly-seeming elderly scholar rather than some more threatening presence, and indignation at having been tested and observed without her knowledge or consent? "You took my research journal," she said, her voice controlled, but carrying an edge of justifiable annoyance. "You violated my privacy and caused me considerable distress with your secretive methods. Surely a simple letter of introduction would have served better than such mysterious games." Reverend Blackwood inclined his head in acknowledgement of her point, his expression showing genuine contrition. "You are absolutely correct, Miss Ashford, and I apologize for the anxiety I caused. My only defense is that the knowledge preserved here has been guarded for so long, protected through so many centuries of religious and political upheaval, that those of us who have inherited the responsibility of its keeping have perhaps become overly cautious, seeing threats where none exist, and employing methods that seem to us prudent, but to others appear merely eccentric or intrusive. He gestured toward the carved stone medallion at the chamber's centre, his aged hand trembling slightly with what might have been excitement, or simply the natural infirmity of advanced years. What you have discovered tonight, what you now stand upon, is the key to understanding the Abbey's true purpose, or rather, one of its purposes. For great institutions serve multiple functions, and Whitby Abbey was no exception. Yes, it was a centre of religious devotion and monastic discipline, but it was also something more, an observatory, a repository of astronomical knowledge, and perhaps most remarkably, a kind of temporal marker designed to preserve and transmit information across the centuries. Holmes had knelt once more beside the carved stone, his lantern positioned to cast light across its intricate surface. And now he looked up at Reverend Blackwood with barely concealed fascination. This stone records a specific astronomical configuration. Miss Ashford was just determining that it represents planetary positions during a winter solstice, though the exact year remains to be calculated. Are you suggesting the Abbey's builders encoded some message or knowledge in this astronomical notation? Something meant to be deciphered by future generations, possessing the mathematical and observational skills to read it. The elderly clergyman rose from his seat with careful deliberation and joined us around the stone medallion, adding his lantern's light to the growing illumination that now rendered the carved patterns in sharp relief against their stone background. Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. The configuration shown here represents the winter solstice of the year 1128, the very night of the Abbey's dedication. But more than merely commemorating that date, the carving incorporates measurements and calculations that encode astronomical data. The precise latitude and longitude of this location, the angle of the Earth's axial tilt, as it was in that era, the positions and movements of celestial bodies observed over years of patient study. He paused, and in that pause I heard a distant sound from above. The wind had returned, moving through the Abbey ruins with a low, mournful note that penetrated even to our underground chamber, reminding us that while we stood in timeless stone examining secrets preserved for centuries, the world above continued its eternal rhythms of wind and wave, darkness and coming dawn. Miss Ashford had set aside her notebook and now knelt beside the stone, running her fingers lightly over the carved symbols as though reading them through touch as well as sight. "But why?" she asked, looking up at Reverend Blackwood with an expression of genuine puzzlement. Why go to such elaborate lengths to preserve astronomical data in architectural form? Surely written records, manuscripts carefully copied and preserved in the Abbey library, would have served more reliably to transmit such knowledge to future generations. The old clergyman smiled, clearly pleased by the question and the opportunity it afforded him to share knowledge he had perhaps carried alone for too long. "Ah, but manuscripts burn, Miss Ashford, as the Abbey's own library did when Henry VIII's commissioners came to dissolve the monasteries and destroy what they deemed superstitious or heretical. Paper crumbles, ink fades, books are lost to fire and flood and simple neglect. But stone endures. Stone survives conquest and reformation, survives the fall of empires and the rise of new orders. The monks who built this place understood that they were living through what we might call a golden age of learning, a time when astronomical knowledge was advancing rapidly. when calculations and observations were refining humanity's understanding of the cosmos. They also understood that such ages do not last forever, that darkness sometimes follows enlightenment, that knowledge can be lost if not preserved in forms that transcend the fragility of written documents. He moved around the stone circle, pointing out specific elements of the carving as he continued his explanation. So they created this and other similar records throughout the Abbey structure as a kind of backup archive, a library written in stone that would survive even if every book and manuscript were destroyed. And their foresight proved justified. When the dissolution came, when the Abbey was stripped of its treasures and left to ruin, all the written astronomical records disappeared, burned or scattered, or simply lost to history. But this remained, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of later construction, waiting for someone with the knowledge and dedication to rediscover and decipher it. Holmes had been making rapid notes throughout this explanation, his pencil moving across the page with the focused intensity that characterized his documentation of significant cases. And the lights we witnessed tonight, Reverend Blackwood, are they connected to this stone archive, or do they represent some separate phenomenon? For the first time, the elderly clergyman's confident demeanour showed uncertainty, his weathered features settling into an expression of thoughtful consideration, mixed with something that might have been wonder, or perhaps a scholar's honest acknowledgement of mystery beyond his current understanding. "The lights," he said slowly, "are something I confess I do not fully comprehend, despite having observed them myself on numerous occasions over the years. They appear to be some form of energy, perhaps electromagnetic, perhaps something we have yet to name scientifically, that manifests in response to specific astronomical configurations. They follow paths that correspond to the Abbey's various astronomical alignments, and they invariably converge here, in this chamber, as though drawn by the stone's encoded information, or perhaps by something deeper still, within the earth beneath our feet." He produced a silver flask from his coat pocket, and took a small sip before offering it around. Fine brandy, its warmth immediately apparent, even from the faint aroma that escaped when the flask was uncapped. We each accepted a small measure gratefully, the spirit providing welcome warmth against the crypt's persistent chill, and I noticed how the simple sharing of drink created a sense of fellowship among our unlikely gathering of detective, doctor, scholar, and elderly clergyman, united by curiosity about ancient mysteries. "There are theories," Reverend Blackwood continued, after returning the flask to his pocket, "preserved in fragmentary form in records that survived the dissolution. Some of the monks believed this location possessed unusual properties, that something in the earth itself, perhaps the particular combination of stone and water, perhaps unknown mineral deposits in the cliff's geological structure, created conditions that amplified or made visible certain natural energies that elsewhere remain imperceptible to human senses. They conducted experiments, documented observations, tried to understand the phenomenon through the scientific methods available to their era." Miss Ashford had resumed her sketching, now incorporating details Reverend Blackwood's explanations had illuminated, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the careful neutrality of a scholar attempting to remain objective, despite encountering ideas that challenged conventional understanding. "Are you suggesting the Abbey was built on this specific location, not merely for its defensive position and harbour access, but because the builders knew of these unusual properties and wished to study them. The old clergyman nodded slowly, his white hair catching the lantern light and seeming almost to glow with its own gentle radiance. Concluding story, resolving mystery, reflecting philosophically. Dawn arrived, not with fanfare, but with subtle gradations of grey sepiadations, of grey seeping into the eastern sky, transforming the crypt's darkness from absolute to merely dim as pale light began filtering down the stone stairway we had descended hours earlier. We had spent the intervening time in earnest discussion and careful documentation. Reverend Blackwood sharing what fragmentary records remained of the medieval monks' astronomical observations, while Holmes and Miss Ashford worked to correlate the stone medallion's encoded information with modern star charts and mathematical calculations. The crypt had become our temporary study, its ancient stones bearing witness to this convergence of past and present knowledge, and I had found myself serving as scribe and occasional commentator, while minds sharper than mine in astronomical matters pursued their intellectual inquiry into realms where science and mystery dwelt as uneasy neighbours. The brandy flask had made several circuits of our small gathering as the night progressed, providing both warmth and a certain convivial relaxation that allowed ideas to flow more freely than rigid formality might have permitted. Holmes had revealed his considerable knowledge of astronomical mathematics, applying modern analytical techniques to the medieval observations encoded in stone, while Miss Ashford contributed her specialized understanding of historical astronomical instruments and calculation methods. Reverend Blackwood served as bridge between eras, translating the fragmentary Latin texts he had preserved into comprehensible English, and providing context about the Abbey's scholarly traditions that illuminated the purpose behind the elaborate architectural encoding we had discovered. Gradually, through patient collaboration and cross-referencing of multiple sources of information, a remarkable picture had emerged. The Abbey's builders had created not merely a single astronomical record, but an entire system of interconnected observations spanning decades of careful study. The stone medallion beneath our feet was one element in a larger framework that included the ceiling bosses Miss Ashford had documented, the window alignments she had measured, and numerous other architectural features distributed throughout the ruins. Together, these elements formed what Reverend Blackwood termed a library in stone, a comprehensive astronomical archive that preserved measurements and calculations with remarkable precision, encoding knowledge that would otherwise have been lost when the Abbey's written records were destroyed during the dissolution. But the mystery of the lights remained imperfectly resolved, hovering at the edge of explanation, like those phenomena that science acknowledges without fully comprehending. Reverend Blackwood's theory about unusual geological properties creating conditions for visible manifestations of natural energies was intriguing but hardly definitive, and Holmes admitted frankly that without instruments capable of measuring electromagnetic fields or other potentially relevant physical parameters, we could only speculate about the light's true nature. What seemed clear was their connection to specific astronomical configurations. They appeared with greatest frequency and intensity when certain celestial alignments occurred, as though the positions of stars and planets somehow influenced whatever process generated the luminous phenomena. As the first pale rays of actual sunlight penetrated the crypt, touching the stone medallion's surface and causing the carved patterns to leap into sharp relief, we witnessed something unexpected and beautiful. The light entering through the crypt entrance at this precise moment of winter sunrise, for we had worked through the night until the solstice dawn, fell across the carved stone in such a way that certain elements became brilliantly illuminated, while others remained in shadow, creating a pattern that resembled a key or diagram, highlighting specific symbols and creating visual connections between elements that had seemed unrelated when viewed under uniform lantern light. Miss Ashford gasped softly, immediately pulling out her notebook to sketch this new pattern before the sun's movement altered the effect. "It's a calendar," she breathed, her pencil flying across the page. The illuminated portions show specific dates throughout the year, equinoxes, solstices, and what appear to be other astronomically significant moments. The monks designed this chamber so that sunlight entering at different times would reveal different information encoded in the carving, creating a dynamic rather than static record that changes with the seasons. Holmes crouched beside her, studying the pattern with intense concentration, and I saw in his expression that particular satisfaction he showed when disparate pieces of evidence suddenly coalesced into coherent explanation. "Ingenious," he murmured. "The same stone serves multiple purposes depending on when and how it is observed. In darkness, by lantern light, one reads certain information. In sunlight, during specific astronomical moments, entirely different patterns emerge. The archive is not just comprehensive, but layered, requiring observation across time to fully access its contents." Reverend Blackwood had moved to stand in the shaft of sunlight, streaming down the stairway, his aged face turned upward toward the growing brightness above. And when he spoke, his voice carried a quality of reverent wonder that seemed entirely appropriate for a man of faith contemplating the intersection of divine creation and human ingenuity. They understood something we moderns sometimes forget in our rush to record everything in books and databases. That knowledge is not meant to be possessed but experienced, not stored but engaged with actively across generations. This stone archive requires participation, requires observers to return again and again, to watch and measure and document across seasons and years, to become part of an ongoing conversation with the past, rather than merely extracting information and moving on. We stood together in that growing light, 4 people separated by age and background and professional calling, yet united in this moment by shared wonder at what human dedication and intelligence had achieved centuries ago in this remote coastal location. The night's mysteries had not been entirely solved. Perhaps they never would be. But we had glimpsed something profound about the continuity of human curiosity, and the lengths to which people will go to preserve knowledge for future generations who might otherwise remain in darkness. Eventually, as the sun climbed higher and the crypt's shadows retreated into corners and crevices, we gathered our materials and prepared to return to the surface. Holmes carefully documented the pattern the winter sunrise had created on the stone medallion, while Miss Ashford filled the final pages of her notebook with observations and sketches that would occupy her analytical attention for months to come. Reverend Blackwood extinguished his lantern with the satisfied air of one who has successfully passed a torch to worthy successors, his role as guardian of ancient knowledge, now shared rather than borne alone. The ascent from the crypt felt easier than our descent had been, perhaps because we climbed toward light rather than descending into darkness, or perhaps simply because exhaustion had moved beyond mere tiredness into that strange clarity that sometimes comes after a sleepless night spent in purposeful activity. We emerged into the Abbey grounds to find the ruins transformed by morning light. Stone that had appeared forbidding and mysterious in darkness now revealed as merely old, weathered, beautiful in its decay, but no longer threatening. The sea beyond gleamed in the sunrise, and gulls wheeled overhead, calling their harsh poetry to the new day. We made our way down the 199 steps in companionable silence, our footsteps echoing in rhythm on the ancient stone, and arrived at the town to find Whitby beginning to stir, shop shutters opening, fishermen preparing their boats, the smell of fresh bread drifting from bakeries where ovens had been burning since before dawn. The ordinary world welcomed us back from our nocturnal adventure in the realm of mysteries and astronomical secrets, reminding us that life continues its simple rhythms regardless of what marvels or enigmas may lie hidden in ancient stones. Mrs. Hawthorne greeted our return to the Angel Inn with motherly scolding about proper rest and sensible hours. Though her eyes twinkled with curiosity, she was too polite to voice directly. She provided an enormous breakfast: eggs and bacon, toast and marmalade, strong tea and fresh cream. And we ate with the appetite of people who have genuinely earned their meal through a night of mental and physical exertion. Reverend Blackwood joined us, regaling us with stories of previous researchers who had touched upon the Abbey's astronomical secrets, without quite grasping their full significance. And gradually, the conversation drifted from scholarly matters to more general topics, the companionable talk of people who have shared an experience that creates lasting bonds. Later, as Holmes and I prepared for our journey back to London, Miss Ashford expressed her gratitude with eloquence that moved beyond mere words to genuine warmth and fellowship. She had found not only answers to her immediate mysteries, but connection to a tradition of astronomical scholarship stretching back centuries, and I could see in her eyes the dedication with which she would pursue this research in the months and years ahead. Reverend Blackwood had offered her access to his private collection of fragmentary records, and had suggested collaboration that would ensure the Abbey's astronomical archive finally received the scholarly attention it deserved. The train south departed in early afternoon, and as we settled into our compartment and watched Whitby recede behind us, I found myself reflecting on the strange interweaving of natural and mysterious we had encountered. The lights remained unexplained in any complete sense, yet their existence seemed less troubling now that we understood the larger context of astronomical observation and geological peculiarity that surrounded them. Some mysteries, I realized, need not be entirely solved to lose their power to disturb. Understanding their context and purpose can be sufficient even when mechanism remains obscure. Holmes sat across from me with his pipe and his thoughts, his eyes distant as they often were after a case's conclusion, processing and cataloguing what we had learned. Eventually he spoke, his voice quiet and contemplative. An interesting investigation, Watson. Not the dramatic confrontation of criminal minds we sometimes encounter, but perhaps more satisfying in its way. Knowledge preserved across centuries. Human dedication to understanding the cosmos. Mysteries that inspire wonder rather than fear. There are worse ways to spend a sleepless night than in the company of scholars pursuing truth through darkness toward light. I nodded agreement, feeling the gentle rocking of the train beginning to lull me toward the sleep I had forgone the previous night. And as my eyes grew heavy, I thought of those ancient monks patiently observing the heavens, carving their knowledge into stone, trusting that someone would eventually decipher their message across the vast distance of centuries. Their faith had been justified, their knowledge preserved, and now awakened to new investigation. Their observatory in ruins, but their work continuing through new hands and minds, devoted to the same eternal questions about humanity's place beneath the wheeling stars. The countryside rolled past our window, familiar and comforting, and somewhere between waking and dreams, I felt gratitude for mysteries that expand understanding rather than contract it, for knowledge that connects past and future, for the privilege of witnessing, even briefly, the remarkable achievements of human curiosity and dedication. If you enjoyed joining us on this coastal mystery beneath the stars of Whitby Abbey, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel and share these stories with others who might find peace in such gentle nocturnal journeys. Please leave a like if this tale brought you comfort, and let me know in the comments what other mysteries you might wish to explore together in future nights. Until we meet again, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember that some of the most profound discoveries come not from seeking answers, but from learning to ask better questions. Good night, dear friend, and may your rest be deep and restorative as the ancient stones themselves, enduring and at peace beneath the eternal watchfulness of the stars.